In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. Setting up an independent Palestinian organization was not easy. The first challenge the Palestinians faced was to wrest control of their own destiny from the Arab regimes. In early 1965, a series of attacks were carried out against Israeli civilians and infrastructure. A previously unknown Palestinian group calling itself Al-Asifa, meaning the storm, seen here in training, claimed responsibility for the attacks. Al-Asifa was started by a small group of Palestinian activists in the diaspora. They believed armed struggle was the only way to win back their lost homeland. The Arab regimes did not share this view. They feared being drawn into a conflict with Israel, for which they did not feel prepared. Palestine had been an area of conflict for many years. In 1947, Great Britain announced it was terminating its mandate over Palestine.
I repeat again that His Majesty's government have determined to base their policy on the assumption that they must lay down the mandate, under which they have sought for 25 years to discharge their obligations to fulfill the growth of the Jewish national home and to protect the interests of the Arab population. In order that there may be no misunderstanding of the attitude and policy of Britain, I have been instructed by His Majesty's government to announce with all solemnity that they have consequently decided that in the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
Britain handed over Palestine to the United Nations. In 1947, the UN General Assembly decided to partition Palestine into two states, one Arab, the other Jewish. This partition plan was rejected by Palestinians and neighboring Arab states. In early 1948, open conflict erupted between Jews and Palestinians. In a confidential briefing at the time, America's Central Intelligence Agency predicted a defeat for the Jews.
As the Arabs gradually coordinate their war effort, the Jews will be forced to withdraw from isolated positions, and, having been drawn into a war of attrition, will gradually be defeated.
Following the withdrawal of the last British troops in May 1948, Jewish leaders proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. On the very next day, 5 Arab armies from Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq immediately declared war. One young Palestinian activist who was living in Cairo at the time was keen to join the fight.
أنا تركت تعليم كنت أدرس واجتمعنا إحنا الطلاب الفلسطينيين في الشبان المسلمين.
I left school. We gathered at the Young Muslims Association and we decided that whoever wanted to fight would have to burn their books. I was among those who burned their books and went and joined the Army of Holy Struggle.
The Arab armies were defeated. The newly declared State of Israel seized control of most of Palestine, with the exception of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. By 1949, close to 750,000 Palestinians had become refugees. In the late 1950s in Kuwait, amid the popular sentiment of Arab unity common in the region, a group of Palestinian exiles established a secret organization. They called it the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. It became known more popularly as Fatah. Yasser Arafat was one of the ringleaders of this new organization, which favored armed struggle to achieve the liberation of Palestine.
في الكويت سميناها فتح.
It was in Kuwait that we named it Fatah. But before that, it was a continuation of our Palestinian nationalistic activities.
Such activities were aimed at gaining autonomy from the Arab regimes, most dominant of which was the regime of Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser. Rival Palestinian groups emerged, advocating coordination with Nasser's regime.
جرى اتصال مع المسؤولين في مصر مع رئيس عبد الناصر.
We took a decision to form a Palestinian branch and coordinated this with President Nasser. It was agreed that our actions would conform with the overall Egyptian military strategy, that we wouldn't carry out military action that would prematurely draw Egypt into a war with Israel, for which it wasn't yet prepared.
In 1964, President Nasser convened the first Arab Summit. His aim was to lead an Arab response to the continued existence and growing dominance of Israel. The Arab leaders voted to set up a body to organize the Palestinians in their diaspora. Ahmed al-Shuqairi, seen here on the right, a Palestinian diplomat from a well-known family, was chosen to head the newly formed body. From the outset, Shuqairi wanted an organization which would not just kowtow to Arab regimes.
The Arabs agreed to set up the PLO as a means of releasing the frustrations felt by the Palestinians. But in came Ahmed al-Shuqairi, who decided he was going to form a proper PLO. And he did. He must take the credit for setting up the PLO, its structure and national charter. He was a great man who should be recognized as such.
4 months later, in May of 1964, Shuqairi convened the first Palestinian parliament in Jerusalem. It was called the Palestine National Council. King Hussein of Jordan, the country which had administered the West Bank since 1950, attended the meeting. The parliament consisted of Palestinian elders as well as a younger generation who called for a more forceful approach to winning back their homeland. The parliament formally announced the establishment of the Palestine Liberation Organization and declared the State of Israel as illegal. To guarantee Jordanian acceptance of the meeting, Shuqairi allayed Jordanian fears by announcing that the PLO had no designs on the West Bank and was only interested in regaining territory from Israel. Shuqairi spent the next few years building support for the PLO. He set out to create a body that could truly be considered a voice for the stateless Palestinians. He traveled far and wide in his endeavors. Here, he is seen in China, where he was accorded a welcome usually reserved for visiting heads of state.
أحمد الشقيري فلسطيني صحيح كان قريب للناصرية.
Ahmed Shuqairi is a Palestinian first and foremost. True, he was close to Nasser, but he proved more than once that he was a Palestinian first. He didn't take on the job to be a tool of Nasser, but to channel the energies of the Palestinian people. He raised the bar when it came to Nasser's views on Palestinian nationalism.
كان المفروض أن ننطلق في 64.
We were supposed to launch in 1964, before the Palestine National Council meeting in Jerusalem. I was there in Jerusalem, but didn't attend the meeting. I was preparing to launch military operations as a gift to the PNC, but we decided against it because we thought it might be perceived as an attempt to upstage the council meeting and its resolutions.
Arafat and his revolutionary comrades in Fatah viewed the newly created PLO with great suspicion. They felt the organization was the product of the same impotent Arab regimes that had lost Palestine in 1948. The Fatah activists wanted instead to take matters into their own hands. And in January 1965, they began attacking targets in Israel. Although militarily insignificant, the first attack was a sign of things to come.
فتح أعلنت عن أول عملية، وأنا برأيي لم تكن أول دورية نزلت للأرض المحتلة.
Fatah declared it had mounted the first operation, although I don't believe it was the first Palestinian patrol to go into occupied Palestine. But the significance is that Fatah's declaration heralded the independence of Palestinian decision-making, that Palestinians would no longer be subservient to Arab government diktat, which would never have approved the launching of the armed struggle.
Arab leaders greeted Fatah's operations with distrust and disdain. They were wary of a radical Palestinian group acting on its own initiative. President Nasser of Egypt suspected Fatah was an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood with whom he was engaged in a vicious struggle. Palestinians who were allied to Nasser hurled elaborate accusations against their fellow Palestinians in Fatah.
كانت الاتهامات تصل إنه هاي خلقتها CIA.
We charged Fatah with being an anti-Nasser body affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, even a creation of the CIA. There was a real battle going on between Egyptian intelligence and Fatah. So when Fatah launched its first operation and announced the beginning of the armed struggle, the Arab nationalist movement mounted an all-out assault on Fatah and accused it of trying to drag Nasser into war.
Other Arab leaders openly spoke out in favor of negotiation rather than armed struggle. In 1966, Tunisian President Habib Bourguiba arrived in Egypt on a tour of the region. While in the West Bank, he advised his Palestinian audience to seek a negotiated settlement in order to resolve the Palestinian refugee problem. A message he repeated in Lebanon.
في بيروت معروف أن فيها صحافة حرة وكل إنسان ينجم يتكلم.
We traveled to Beirut, which was known for its free press. We heard a lot of illogical things at the press conference held by Bourguiba. Someone said we are prepared to wait 100 years for a solution to the Palestinian issue. To which Bourguiba replied, "You are a journalist and not a Palestinian. Had you been a Palestinian, you would be adamant that a solution be found as soon as possible."
Bourguiba's comments drew a hostile response. The Arab press denounced him as a traitor and a madman. In Cairo, the Tunisian embassy was set alight by angry demonstrators. The Arab leaders seemed to be out of step with the mood on the street. For his part, President Nasser sought to convince the West of the need to address the problem of the Palestinians before it provoked further violence and instability.
About the rights of the Arabs of Palestine who were expelled out of their country. We have about 1.5 million refugees expelled completely. You know, the Israelis speak about the Nazi treatment and how they were badly treated in Germany during the Second World War and before the war and so on. They treated the Arabs the same way, expelled them, killed their children, destroyed their villages, and there was escape from Palestine to the Arab country. I was there on 40. There were the United Nations resolutions, the Security Council resolution. Nothing was fulfilled. And then Israel took everything, took the property of those people, everything, the land, everything from those. What about the rights of those people? You are from Britain. Do you accept to give Manchester to some other people? And if you are American, I ask you, do you accept to give California to some other people? Or do you accept the status quo of occupying Manchester by some other people, by the Chinese, for instance, and then reach agreement after expelling the people of Manchester from their homes, depriving them from their property, from everything? This is the question of Palestine. This question is not represented in Britain or in the West because of the influence of the Jewish propaganda. The Arabs of Palestine want to return back to their homeland, to regain their property. What was the answer of the Israelis? The answer of the Israelis was no. They will not permit single Arab to return back, and they will not give them back their property. But we can do the Arabs. If you have a right and nobody is ready to give it to you, so the only solution is force.
Ask this man, when does he think he'll go back to Palestine?
Nasser's views were echoed by Palestinian refugees who believed liberation was close at hand.
إن شاء الله السنة هذه في أقرب وقت إن شاء الله يعني خلال الصيف هذا
He's hoping to go back to Palestine this very year. How does he think he's going to do that? كيف تظن أنك ستعود إلى فلسطين؟ كيف تظن أنك ستعود إلى فلسطين؟
في طريق التحرير.
He is going to liberate Palestine. How is he going to liberate it? Well, with the force of arms or how? كيف يمكنك تحرير فلسطين يا ترى بطريق السلاح؟
بطريق السلاح نعم.
Yes, by force of arms.
The revolutionaries of Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, found refuge and support within Syria, viewed as one of the most hardline regimes in the region at the time. And it was Syria that brought matters to a head in 1967.
سوريا بدأت تصرخ أيام صلاح جديد بأن الإسرائيليين يستعدون.
Syria began to cry wolf, claiming that Israel was about to wage war against it, and the Soviets concurred. So Nasser sent an Egyptian military delegation to the Golan that studied the situation and returned with the view that war was not in the offing. But then the Soviets repeated their claims of a coming war.
With the mantle of leader of the Arab world firmly upon his shoulders, President Nasser found it difficult to step back from the escalating tensions in the region. In May 1967, he requested the withdrawal of United Nations observers from Sinai and closed the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping. To Israel, these moves were tantamount to a declaration of war. With conflict imminent, Arab leaders attempted to close ranks. King Hussein of Jordan, who had been the target of accusations and insults by Egyptian state media, made a hasty reconciliation with Nasser.
Letting bygones be bygones was a means of escaping the insults. Egyptian media perfected personal attacks on His Majesty. But the euphoria of the reconciliation and path to war was soon transformed into weeping, which has continued to this day.
A frenzied Arab world waited for the outbreak of war. As in 1948, expectations of an Arab victory and the destruction of Israel were high. The reality proved very different. In June 1967, in a matter of hours, Israel decimated the Egyptian Air Force. Israeli ground troops seized the Sinai Peninsula, overran Syria's Golan Heights, and occupied East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. The Arab world was shocked and stunned. The Arabs lost what remained of Palestine, and even more Palestinians were forced to flee their homeland. Fatah felt vindicated. The Arab states had yet again proved incapable of defeating Israel. With the Arab regimes in disarray, the path now lay open for the Palestinians to fight for themselves.
كانت مؤثرة جدا، ولكن كانت حافز كبير إنه لابد من التعويض.
The defeat in 1967 was very painful, but at the same time, it was a great incentive for us to work harder and achieve something.
أنا من الناس اللي كنت أدخل من الحدود السورية اللبنانية للسورية.
After the war, I used to make my way from the Lebanese border to Syria onto Jordan. I was never questioned. My car was full of weapons. The Arab armies were defeated, broken. We used to go to the Golan to gather weapons left by the retreating Syrians. There was a state of utter destruction, in which the Palestinians, whose cause it was, rose and took action.
Arafat, traveling incognito, made his way into the occupied West Bank in an effort to organize resistance. But the Israelis were close on his heels.
كان عندنا مش أقل من 500-600 فدائي بالضفة الغربية.
We had at least 500 to 600 members in the West Bank. In about 15 days, Israeli Defense Minister Dayan managed to capture about 300 of them, and everything fell apart. I remember Arafat being in the West Bank at the time, traveling under assumed names and having to escape.
In September 1967, Arab leaders met in Khartoum to define a clearer and more uncompromising stance to Israel. They issued what became known as the three no's. No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, and no recognition of Israel. Chastened by the 1967 defeat, President Nasser made a political U-turn and embraced Fatah.
ومنا من كان ناصريا وأصبح قال فيش هناك حزب ناصر قلت يا سيادة الرئيس أنا ناصر.
A group of us in Fatah went to Egypt and we finally met with Nasser. I told him I was a Nasserist. I said we are a group of young men who believed in their God and country and were intent on liberating it. He said Egypt would from now on share everything with us.
Egypt began providing training and support for Fatah's guerrillas on the condition that operations not be mounted from Egyptian territory. Jordan quickly became the springboard of attack. The government in Amman could only stand by and watch. In March 1968, Palestinian guerrillas attacked a bus, killing 2 Israelis. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan vowed to teach the Palestinians a lesson. The target was the Jordanian village of Karame in the Jordan Valley, which had become a Fatah stronghold. Some 15,000 Israeli troops were mobilized and took part in the attack. The Palestinian defenders put up a stiff resistance. Jordanian army and artillery support proved crucial, inflicting heavy casualties on the invading Israelis. But not all Palestinian factions had favored a fight. Some had withdrawn from Karame on the eve of the battle, leaving only Arafat's Fatah in the field.
The Arab nationalist movement believed it was a mistake for a guerrilla force to face the enemy head-on, and therefore withdrew its fighters from Karame. But Arafat took into account the popular reaction to such a confrontation and the support the Fidayeen would gain in its aftermath.
قلت لهم شيء. إحنا كأمة عربية.
The Jordanian chief of staff and the commander of the Iraqi forces tried to convince me to withdraw from Karama.
خلينا نصمد فيها. وخلينا نستشهد فيها.
I told them after the defeat of 1967, we took an oath to fight to the very end, and even if it meant martyrdom.
The Israeli army defeated the Palestinians at Karame. But a potent legend was born, that the Arabs would stand and fight, and that the Israelis were not invincible. Karame proved a tremendous boost to Arafat's Fatah movement. Thousands of volunteers flocked to Palestinian guerrilla camps, while Arabs across the Middle East donated funds and supplies to these fighters. 3 years after its launch, Fatah and the Palestinian armed struggle now emerged into the mainstream. By gaining autonomy from Arab states and fighting for themselves, the Palestinians now became masters of their own destiny. From now on, the way of the gun was the path forward. But those guns would soon face off with fellow Arabs. In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. by the end of the 60s, the Palestinians had become masters of their own destiny. But a bloody showdown was on the horizon. Not with Israel, but with fellow Arabs. The Palestinian Commando movement emerged as a force to be reckoned with in the region following the defeat of the Arab states in the 1967 war. The Palestinians had taken their first step towards emancipation from the Arab world.
All of these factors dealt a knockout blow to the Arab custodianship of the Palestinians and their cause, and thus Palestinians became the masters of their destiny.
The Palestinians took full advantage of the state of chaos suffered by the defeated Arab regimes. Palestinian guerrilla factions, the most prominent of which was Fatah, consolidated their grip on the refugee camps in the Arab world. Hundreds of fresh recruits enrolled to join these factions. The image of young Fidaiyin, or freedom fighters, clad in the traditional Palestinian headscarf, became an icon of resistance. Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser cast aside his initial misgivings and embraced Fatah. At the same time, he dissolved his traditional alliance with the Arab nationalist movement, a rival Palestinian faction to Fatah.
Nasser broke off his relationship with the Arab nationalist movement and adopted Fatah. Not only did he adopt Fatah, but he also took Arafat with him on a trip to Moscow.
I walked in and Nasser met me across the room. And lo and behold, the Soviet Troika got up, walked towards me and greeted me. The next day, they launched an official dialogue with me.
Other Arab regimes also vied for influence among the Palestinians as a way to gain leverage on the regional scene. Both Iraq and Syria encouraged the establishment of new Palestinian guerrilla factions allied to them. A declassified CIA document found that Fatah's independence had influenced Syria's decision to set up a Palestinian faction whose allegiance lay firmly with Damascus.
The Syrian government, unable to subvert Fatah for use as a political weapon, recently organized a group known as the Vanguard of the People's Liberation War.
But not all Arab states held the Palestinians in such high esteem. King Hussein was still reeling from the loss of the West Bank in 1967.
Israel's occupation of the West Bank effectively meant the loss of half the country. Imagine a person suddenly having to walk on one leg. That's why the 1967 war was such an earthquake for Jordan.
In Jordan, armed Palestinians strolled through the streets, enjoying freedom of movement and launching operations from Jordanian territory against Israel. Jordan began to view these attacks with increasing alarm. Nasser was assisting the Palestinians in training and arms, but he ensured that no operations were launched from Egyptian territory without stringent Egyptian control and coordination. Fatah and other Palestinian factions acted with much greater freedom within the weaker state of Jordan. In 1969, Palestinian commandos shot down a Lebanese army helicopter during clashes with the Lebanese state. An Egyptian brokered agreement known as the Cairo Accord put an end to the clashes. But the accord effectively legitimized the presence of armed Palestinian factions on Lebanese soil, something which was to have serious consequences for stability in Lebanon in the years to come. Besides creating waves in Arab regimes, the Palestinian factions also revolutionized their own society. In 1969, Fatah leader Yasser Arafat was elected chairman of the PLO. The election marked a new era. The guerrillas were in the ascendant, overthrowing the traditional hold of more established Palestinian families. Such was the impact of the PLO and the Fidaiyin that Arafat's image had made the cover of Time magazine. But it was in Jordan, the base for most of the Palestinian factions, where the Fidaiyin's growing assertiveness caused most problems. They had set up a state within a state in Jordan, and the actions they planned and carried out soon began to rock the region. Armed gunmen roamed the streets of the capital Amman and Jordan's other main cities like Irbid and Zarqa. Palestinian guerrillas no longer restricted themselves to bases in the more inaccessible parts of the country. Complaints about Palestinian excesses quickly mounted.
Between 1967 and 1971, there were more than 30,000 cases of lawlessness, from the throwing of hand grenades to premeditated murder. There were even attacks against His Majesty the King. All of this was tolerated with tremendous patience by His Majesty, because I think he felt a certain responsibility for the events of 1967. To his dying days, he felt it, especially the loss of Jerusalem.
King Hussein may have felt for the loss of Jerusalem and the West Bank in 1967, but his patience with the Palestinians was beginning to wear thin. For their part, Palestinian figures to this day contend that dark forces were at play, determined to bring about a showdown.
To be honest, we were not saints in Jordan. We made mistakes, but these mistakes were made out to be sins. Jordanian intelligence used to create their own Fidayeen organizations whose role was to wreak havoc in the country. We apprehended one such organization set up by military intelligence with some 70 members. We deported them to Syria and we later released them.
The revolutionary zeal of the Palestinians knew no boundaries. Radical leftist ideology could be seen sprayed on mosque walls. Private property was considered up for grabs.
هذه الطفرة اليسارية والطفولة اليسارية ظهرت.
This leftist zeal, I call it their late childhood, manifested itself in the celebration of Lenin's birthday, in delivering Marxist speeches from pulpits of mosques. It was an excuse for theft. Expensive cars would be stolen, and the excuse was that they belonged to the bourgeois classes. It was leftist immaturity.
They were acts of provocation. The Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine used to paint slogans such as "All power to the resistance." What does this mean? It means that the Democratic Front was working towards the overthrow of the Jordanian regime.
Tensions were rising on the streets of Amman. The dominant Palestinian faction, Fatah, attempted to distance itself from such excesses. But the Arafat could not or would not rein in the different factions and was unable to prevent the situation spiraling out of control. Groups such as the Popular Front and the Democratic Front were independent factions over which Arafat exerted little control. Things began to come to a head in July 1970 when Palestinian factions in Jordan staged massive rallies condemning President Nasser for accepting a peace plan submitted by US Secretary of State William Rogers. Palestinian demonstrators shouted insults at Nasser. The Egyptian leader was furious.
فذهبت إلى الأستاذ هيكل وقال لي إيه اللي جرالكم؟ إيه اللي حصل؟
Nasser's aide Haikal said, "What are you doing? The president is upset. You're swearing at us and using the radio station we provided you with in Egypt to do it." Then Nasser received us in Alexandria. He said he had been pacing up and down for 2 hours, trying to stop himself from saying anything that would hurt us.
With tensions increasing in Jordan, it was a bad time for the Palestinians to fall out of favor with Nasser. To this day, some Palestinians feel the Egyptian leader gave a nod and a wink to King Hussein of Jordan to punish the Palestinians.
That's true. He told King Hussein to twist our ear, but he didn't ask him to massacre us. And then Nasser went to Marsa Matruh, so he would not be in Cairo when things came to a head.
But the Jordanians were still in two minds about what course of action to pursue against the armed Palestinians in their midst. Prime Minister Wasfi Attal recommended a more conciliatory approach.
I told him the Palestinians will not withdraw unless they are faced with a superior force. So Wasfi Attal said, "Are you dissenting?" I said no. This is our recommendation based on the intelligence available to us. His Majesty then intervened and adopted my recommendation.
On September 6, 1970, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP, forced the Jordanians' hand. It hijacked airliners belonging to Swissair and TWA and forced them to land at a disused runway in the Jordanian desert known as Dawson's Field. A third hijacking of an Israeli aircraft was thwarted mid-air, with one hijacker killed and the other captured. The plane landed in London and the hijacker Layla Khalid was taken into custody. Then, a PFLP member in Bahrain hijacked a British airliner and forced it to fly to Dawson's Field to join the other two hijacked planes. This spectacular act of air piracy was masterminded by a senior PFLP leader called Wadi' Haddad. The PFLP was born from the remnants of the Arab nationalist movement and headed by George Habash. It adopted a revolutionary Marxist doctrine. Wadi' Haddad was one of its co-founders. He had become a mastermind of airline hijacking. Beginning in 1968, Haddad had put his theories of revolutionary violence into practice by hijacking several Israeli and Western aircraft. But the multiple hijacking in 1970 was his most important feat to date. It required meticulous, even scientific, planning.
During the planning stages, Wadi' had sent engineers and surveyors to Dawson's Field. They had returned with a recommendation that the runway could handle modern jets.
وديع حداد حسيته حتى لما كان يحكي بنبرة حادة جدا.
Wadi' Haddad spoke in sharp tone. He was obviously the man in charge. He told our chief of staff to pull the Jordanian troops back. He added that if we didn't comply, he would immediately blow up the planes within seconds. And he emphasized it in English by saying, "I mean it." I remember this clearly.
On September 12th, the PFLP removed the passengers and blew up the planes. With his hold on power rapidly disintegrating, King Hussein formed a military cabinet to finally deal with the anarchy in his country. The cabinet included intelligence officer Adnan Abu Audi.
When the military cabinet was formed on September 16th, I became Minister of Information. Wasfi Tell told me I would be the principal negotiator with the Palestinians. He said we would scare them into coming to the negotiation table. He never said anything about driving them out of Jordan.
Prime Minister Wasfi Tell's conciliatory approach did not win the day. The Jordanian army had other plans and deployed in full force onto the streets of Amman and Jordan's other cities. Vicious street battles soon erupted between army troops and Palestinian guerrillas. Fighting for their lives, the Fidayeen put up a stiff resistance in the face of a Jordanian army bent on exacting revenge for all the humiliations it had endured at the hands of the guerrillas. Casualties mounted, with the Palestinians estimating that around 4,000 people were killed, most of them civilians.
Civilians bear the brunt of urban warfare. We estimate that we lost around 950 fighters in Black September. And as for the civilians, Arafat exaggerates and says around 10,000 died. But the real figure is around 4,000 to 5,000 civilians killed.
In the region, Arab anger mounted at what was perceived as an attempt at liquidating the Palestinian liberation movement. Promises of military assistance to the Palestinians from Iraqi forces stationed in Jordan failed to materialize.
The Iraqi forces stationed in Jordan were not there to assist the Palestinians. Their duty was to aid the defense of Jordan against Israel. They didn't let the Palestinians down.
While Iraq kept its forces out of the fighting, the rival Ba'athist government in Damascus sought to intervene. Syria mobilized its armed forces and sent them into Jordan to support the PLO fighters. However, Syrian Defense Minister Hafez al-Assad refused to provide air cover to the advancing Syrian armor. King Hussein contemplated the unsavory option of requesting Israeli air support in a bid to beat back the Syrian advance.
First, the Israelis agreed to mobilize their forces to get the Syrians' attention. And that's all they did, actually. But they were ready to use their air force if requested. We managed to get the message back to them that the king doesn't want you to go in on the ground, and we don't want you to, but mobilization's fine. Don't do anything until we say to. That is, get ready to act if necessary, but don't do anything. And as you probably know, this was a dramatic moment. King Hussein used his own air force, and Hafez al-Assad stood down the Syrian air force. He knew that the Israelis might go into action if the Syrian air force acted.
أنا لا أدري إذا كان هو فقط العامل اللي كان مؤثر على موقف حافظ الأسد هو عامل له علاقة.
I'm not sure what the determining factor was for Assad. Was it his relationship with the Jordanian regime? Was it internal power struggle within Syria? Or did it have anything to do with the threats he was getting from the Americans and the Israelis not to intervene? He was aware of all of this, and he may have used the circumstances to his advantage, because shortly afterwards he mounted a coup d'etat and came to power.
Assad's position at this time would be a precursor to his future split with Yasser Arafat. The Palestinians were now on the run. An Arab League delegation headed by Sudanese President Jafar Nimeri and including Kuwait's Defense Minister Sheikh Saad Abdullah al-Sabah arrived in the Jordanian capital and managed to whisk a besieged Yasser Arafat out to Cairo.
هنا جاءت اللجنة العربية.
The Arab delegation came to Amman. They dressed Arafat in Kuwaiti robes and smuggled him out. Sheikh Saad was a hero.
On September 27, 1970, Nasser brokered a ceasefire agreement which was signed by Arafat and King Hussein. The following day, Nasser died, leaving the Palestinians without their benefactor. Arafat and Hussein signed a further agreement regulating the presence of Palestinian fighters in Jordan. But some Palestinians refused to accept the deal. The agreement collapsed, and in July 1971, King Hussein continued his attack. The Jordanian army overran the remaining PLO bases and positions, forcing the Palestinians to capitulate. Some Palestinian fighters chose to give themselves up to Israeli forces across the River Jordan rather than surrender to what they viewed as a grim fate at the hands of the Jordanians. Henceforth, the Palestinians would term the events that led to their expulsion from Jordan as Black September. The PLO had held sway over large areas of Jordan. Now it was transformed into a broken movement in search of a sanctuary. One of Fatah's leaders, Salah Khalaf, otherwise known as Abu Iyad, was determined that the PLO remain a force to be reckoned with despite the defeat in Jordan.
فقال أنتم أمام مهمة صعبة للغاية.
Abu Iyad gathered a group of us and said, "You have to prove to the world that the revolution has survived. We must show the world the long arm of the revolution."
Abu Iyad announced the birth of a new group, which came to be known as the Black September Organization, taking its name from the conflict with Jordan. In November 1971, at an Arab Defense Ministers' Council in Cairo, Black September struck its first blow. The target was this man, Jordanian Prime Minister Wasfi al-Tal, whom Palestinians accused of responsibility for their expulsion from Jordan.
Our group decided to assassinate Wasfi al-Tal by any means possible. There were 4 of us in the hit team. I was under the command of Abu Iyad and Abu Hassan Salam. They ordered us to go to Egypt. It was Sunday, November 28, 1971. 3 of us waited for Wasfi al-Tal in the lobby of the Cairo Sheraton. As soon as he entered the hotel, we opened fire on him. We shot him 14 times. Then we gave ourselves up. That was the plan. We were to kill him and then go to trial to gain media exposure.
The role that Yasser Arafat played in forming Black September and planning its operations has always been open to conjecture. Today, Al Jazeera can finally reveal the truth.
Arafat knew everything. He wasn't a guitar player. He was the leader of the revolution.
Abu Iyad used to act in concert with Arafat. When we were preparing for an operation in Jordan, Arafat came to our camp but didn't meet with us. Then Abu Iyad came by helicopter and met with us while Arafat was in another room in the camp. He didn't want to meet with us, but later on he did visit us.
The assassination of Tal was just the opening shot of the Black September organization. A more dramatic operation was carried out the following year at an event chosen by the Palestinians because they knew the whole world would be watching. At the 1972 Munich Olympics, Black September operatives infiltrated the Olympic Village, killing 2 Israeli athletes and seizing another 11 as hostages. The kidnappers demanded a prisoner swap and a plane to fly them out of West Germany. Holding the hostages at gunpoint, the kidnappers were transported by bus to an airbase and then flown by helicopter to an airfield, where 2 of them were shot dead by German snipers when they went to inspect the aircraft. German authorities claim another of the kidnappers then lobbed a hand grenade into the helicopter, killing all of the Israeli hostages. To this day, one of the principal planners of the operation remains unrepentant.
كنا ضباط جيش، احنا قتلنا ضباط جيش بملابس رياضية.
The hostages were all army officers. We killed only army officers who were dressed in sports tracksuits. The Israelis kill unarmed civilians. We did not murder children or unarmed civilians, but 2 months before Munich, the Israelis bombed a school, killing children. So the world must have a more balanced outlook.
Further acts of violence ensued, grabbing the world headlines. In March of 1973, Black September gunmen stormed a diplomatic reception at the Saudi Arabian embassy in Khartoum. A siege ensued, which ended when the gunmen executed the American ambassador to Sudan, his deputy, and the Belgian chargé d'affaires. A declassified US State Department cable stated the operation was carried out with the full knowledge and authority of Yasser Arafat. The report also stated,
one of the primary goals of the operation was to strike at the United States because of its efforts to achieve a Middle East peace settlement, which many Arabs believe would be inimical to Palestinian interests.
By the end of 1973, the PLO leaders had decided that the Black September organization had outlived its usefulness. In the aftermath of the October 1973 war, a new political climate had emerged. Yasser Arafat now recognized that there was a limit to what military action could achieve, and that the Palestinians must present an acceptable political program to the world if their liberation movement was to achieve its goals. Defeat in Jordan and a series of headline-grabbing acts of violence had ensured the survival of the Palestinian revolution, but damaged it in the eyes of the world. Arafat decided that from now on, the gun would only support but not supplant his political agenda. But this view was not shared by other Palestinian factions, nor did it prove realistic, as the PLO was soon drawn into a civil war in a neighboring Arab country. In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. Following expulsion from Jordan, PLO leader Yasser Arafat decided to pursue the path of diplomacy. There were hopeful signs in the early 70s, but the optimism was all to come crashing down.
لقد جئتكم يا سيادة الرئيس بغصن الزيتون في يدي وببندقية الثائر في يدي فلا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي لا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي
لا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي
لا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي.
In November 1974, Yasser Arafat received a standing ovation at the General Assembly of the United Nations. He had spoken of a peaceful solution to Palestinian demands for a homeland. For the guerrilla leader, standing among statesmen, it was a crowning achievement. Arafat's journey to the UN had begun several years earlier. Following their expulsion from Jordan, some Palestinian factions concluded their fiery rhetoric and revolutionary zeal had harmed rather than helped their cause.
Are you saying at the same time that there will be an increase in terrorism outside?
No, I am saying there will be an increase in revolutionary struggle inside Palestine. And I refuse the word terrorism because we are not terrorists. Our people in Palestine, if you are following them, they are doing demonstrations every day in Nablus, in Ramallah. They are refusing the Israeli conquer. Why do you call this terrorism?
But if at the same time you hijack international aircraft and hold as hostages innocent women and children, how do you expect the rest of the world to sympathize and respect the Palestinian cause?
First of all, the PFLP has declared lately that we stop this type of actions. This is number one. And number two, during all these actions which were done previously, we did not do harm to anybody.
However, PFLP operative Wadi Haddad did not agree with Habash. Haddad dissented and was expelled from the group. But this did not prevent him from organizing further operations. In 1975, he sent a group headed by the Venezuelan revolutionary Carlos to Vienna to storm a meeting of OPEC and take several oil ministers hostage. But Haddad was angry that Carlos had not followed the meticulous plans he had drawn up.
الشيء اللي يمكن وديع لم يكتشفه في كارلوس هو هاي الذاتية اللي كان فيها في داخله.
What Wadia may not have realized about Carlos is his narcissism, which manifested itself in the OPEC operation. Carlos acted against Wadia's orders, and when they met afterwards, Wadia slapped him. I think when Carlos negotiated and released the oil ministers, it gave the impression that he could be bribed, which was a main reason for the failure of the operation. From that moment, Wadia broke his connection with Carlos.
A year later, a group of Haddad's followers hijacked an Air France airliner to Entebbe, Uganda. The Israelis mounted a spectacular rescue operation, killing all the hijackers and freeing the hostages. Despite these acts of violence, the political track was moving. Following the 1970 expulsion from Jordan, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the DFLP, believed a more realistic political program was required. In 1972, it had floated the idea of accepting a two-state solution. By the summer of 1974, the PLO had unanimously adopted the DFLP's 10-point plan. For the first time, the Palestinians spoke about establishing an independent national authority. The word Israel was never explicitly mentioned in the plan, but after years of armed struggle, the Palestinians were now implicitly recognizing the State of Israel.
لأن البرنامج عرضته القيادة العامة وسمي برنامج المستسلمين.
It was opposed by the pro-Syrian PFLP General Command and called the defeatist agenda. But Arafat and Abu Iyad were smart. They used the DFLP as a bulldozer or minesweeper to clear the way for it.
ونشب النقاش ممتدا ما يقارب العام الكامل.
It took almost a year of discussions, and on the eve of the PNC session in June of 1974, we came to a consensus with Fatah, the PFLP and the pro-Syrian Sa'iqa, and the 10-point program was adopted.
Just weeks prior to his speech at the UN, Arafat received the mandate he'd long been seeking from Arab leaders. The Arab League summit in Rabat stripped Jordan of its traditional role in Palestinian affairs and named the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. For the Palestinians, it was a dream come true. Their decision-making would no longer be bound by the yoke of Arab diktat, although Arab states would continue to try and exert influence on Palestinian matters. The Jordanians felt the Rabat summit decision pointed the finger of blame at them.
I wonder what would have happened if His Majesty had expressed his displeasure by withdrawing from the Rabat summit while leaving his Prime Minister there. Jordan was being harassed. Jordan was made out to be the root of the problem, not Israel.
Soon after Arafat's triumph at the UN in November 1974, consensus among the different Palestinian factions over the two-state solution proposal began to falter. After its expulsion from Jordan, the PLO had moved its headquarters to the Lebanese capital, Beirut. In April 1975, civil war broke out in Lebanon. Lebanese politics divided into two camps, a Christian-led right and a Muslim-dominated left led by the socialist Druze politician Kamal Jumblat. For years, Lebanon's Muslims had clamored for a fairer distribution of political power. The Palestinians felt a natural affinity for their cause. Desperate not to repeat the mistakes committed in Jordan, the PLO leader sought to keep his forces out of the Lebanese conflict.
I know that Arafat tried to keep the Palestinians out of the war at the beginning, but that was never going to be possible. Impossible. Especially with the common nationalisms, you know, the Kamal Jumblat version of nationalism and the Palestinian version of nationalism.
But by 1976, the Palestinians no longer felt able to stay on the sidelines in Lebanon. Palestinian fighters linked up with the leftist forces and gradually advanced into the Christian heartland. Syria found the idea of a PLO-backed regime in Lebanon a recipe for disaster. It feared such a regime would provoke Israel into military action that would drag Syria into war. For their part, Israel and the United States also took a dim view of the rise of the Lebanese left and its Palestinian allies. In one of the more bizarre alignments of interests in Lebanon, Syria decided to throw its weight behind the Christians. With a green light from Washington and tacit Israeli consent, Syria sent its army into Lebanon in June of 1976 to stem the Palestinian leftist advance.
كان طلب من سوريا آنذاك أن تدخل إلى لبنان.
Syria was asked to intervene to curb the expansion of the Palestinian and Lebanese leftists. The Lebanese left had become troublesome to Arab regimes. The leader of the left, Kamal Jumblat, was viewed as a threat to Lebanese and Arab stability. Another factor was the mutual dislike between Arafat and Syrian President Assad.
Syria's military intervention was stepped up following an assault on a Damascus hotel by the anti-Arafat Abu Nidal Palestinian group. The perpetrators were quickly apprehended and hanged in public. Faced with the Syrian onslaught, Arafat appealed to the Arab world for assistance, accusing Syria of attempting to liquidate the Palestinian resistance. The Syrian assault forced the Palestinians onto the defensive. They were no longer able to mount an effective resupply of their besieged refugee camps in the Christian areas. The camps, principal among which was Tel Zatar, were overrun and their residents expelled or massacred. Two Arab summits were quickly convened. They established what became known as the Arab Deterrent Forces, made up principally of the same Syrian forces that had entered Lebanon, with only token representation from several other Arab states. Syria had prevailed.
President Assad's view was that Syria, in its bid to achieve strategic parity with Israel, had to be supported by two strong wings, a Lebanese wing and a Palestinian wing. That is, if Syria was to have influence on the political scene, it had to become the sole legitimate representative of Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinians.
While Lebanon was in the throes of conflict, on another front, there were moves towards peace. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, a long-standing ally of Arafat, made a groundbreaking visit to Israel to sue for peace in exchange for land. Arafat was stunned. But Arafat had been making his own peace moves. His representative in London, Saeed Hamami, had been promoting the Palestinian vision of a two-state solution at Arafat's behest.
أبو عمار والقيادة الفلسطينية كانت مقتنعة.
Arafat and the Palestinian leadership were convinced that the most important thing was achieving Palestinian aspirations, not the method employed to achieve them. And if the method to achieve them was a civilized and peaceful one, then that would be better than a violent one. Arafat and the PLO leadership firmly believed this.
Chairman Arafat knew very well that the 1973 war demonstrated the limits of collective Arab action and what the international community could accept. Therefore, the leadership of Fatah was convinced that the Palestinians could never achieve anything more than a state based on the lands occupied in 1967.
But some Palestinians took a very different view. Palestinian guerrilla leader Abu Nidal believed the two-state solution was tantamount to capitulation. He split from the PLO and formed his own group, calling it Fatah, the Revolutionary Council, and based it in Baghdad. The Iraqi regime, once again hostile to Arafat's leadership of the PLO, provided backing to Abu Nidal's splinter group. In January of 1978, gunmen loyal to Abu Nidal assassinated Saeed Hamami at the PLO office in London. It was to be the first of many killings of fellow Palestinians that Abu Nidal would carry out. Despite its talk of a two-state solution, the mainstream Fatah under Arafat did not relinquish its armed struggle. In March 1978, a Fatah unit led by a female commando, Dalal al-Mughrabi, commandeered an Israeli bus near the city of Haifa. In the ensuing firefight, 36 Israelis were killed. Israel responded by invading southern Lebanon and setting up what it termed as a security zone to drive PLO forces out of rocket range. Almost a year later, Israel struck a massive blow against the PLO by assassinating Abu Hassan Salameh. Salameh was in charge of Arafat's personal security. Over the years, he had been developing contacts with the CIA and was seen as a point man for interaction with the Americans.
We had, through the CIA, some kind of a liaison relationship with Ali Hassan Salameh, and that had to do ostensibly with security issues. And it worked. The embassy was never attacked in those days. Now, people still argue whether that relationship led to Ali Hassan Salameh becoming an agent of the CIA or not. I personally think that he did, but I can't prove it. I was in government during that period, and we were in fact receiving remarkably sensitive intelligence from inside the PLO at the highest levels. And if it wasn't Ali Hassan Salameh, it was somebody very much like him.
Arafat could do little to parry such blows being delivered by Israel. But it was a different matter when Abu Nidal resumed his assassination of Fatah representatives abroad. In June 1978, from his base in Baghdad, Abu Nidal ordered the killing of Fatah's bureau chief in Kuwait. Fatah explicitly accused Iraqi intelligence of complicity in the assassination. 2 months later, the Abu Nidal group killed Fatah's Paris representative. Fatah retaliated by attacking the Iraqi embassy in Paris and targeting Iraqi diplomats in London, Paris, and Karachi. Abu Nidal struck yet again on June 1, 1981, killing the PLO Brussels representative. But Abu Nidal's most significant operation was to come a year later. On June 3, 1982, an Abu Nidal gunman opened fire on Israel's ambassador to London, critically wounding him. Israel responded by launching a military operation more massive than its 1973 war effort against the combined forces of Egypt and Syria. The 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon had been an open secret for some time. The Lebanon-Israel border had been a constant point of tension as Palestinians and Israelis traded rocket and artillery fire. Arafat had realized that it was only a matter of time before Israel launched an all-out attack.
الوحيد اللي بدأ يعمل حساب لهذا الاحتمال هو ياسر عرفات.
Arafat was the only one who believed an Israeli invasion which would reach Beirut was inevitable. He convened the PLO's military council and formed a committee headed by the PLO's chief of staff Saad Sail to plan the defense of Beirut.
Many Palestinians expected a repeat of the 1978 invasion, an assault with limited objectives.
ساد مناخ يعتقد فعلا بأن العملية الإسرائيلية لن تكون شاملة.
The belief was that the Israeli operation would not extend beyond 40 kilometers from the international border. This affected Palestinian preparations for the invasion, as well as Syrian and Lebanese preparations. Therefore, resistance to the invasion in southern Lebanon was ineffective.
On June 6, 1982, after 2 days of airstrikes, Israel launched its land invasion of Lebanon. With the exception of stiff resistance put up by the defenders of the Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon, Palestinian forces in general quickly collapsed. Commanders abandoned their fighters in the field and fled for safety. Arafat was livid.
Arafat was incredulous. He kept on saying impossible. He couldn't believe the Israelis were advancing so far, so quickly. He ordered stiff resistance. Later on, I learned that he was very angry that there was no real resistance.
The operational headquarters in the south seriously miscalculated. The commanders believed that all was lost and left. I went to Arafat's headquarters in Beirut and told him what happened. He became agitated and started swearing.
Syrian forces in Lebanon were drawn into the fighting. An epic 3-day air battle left the Syrian Air Force virtually decimated. Unable to sustain such losses, Syria agreed a ceasefire with Israel within the first week of the invasion. The Palestinians were now left on their own.
Arafat did not just accept that the Syrians had been defeated. He made it seem like the Syrians didn't fight at all. But the Syrians did fight in the Bekaa Valley and the mountains around Beirut and lost lots of men and equipment, but they fought to defend themselves and not the Palestinians. The Syrian army had no orders to check the Israeli advance if the Israelis had left the Syrians alone.
By now, the Israelis had arrived at the gates of the Lebanese capital. But the closer they drew to Beirut, the tougher the fighting became.
They fought, and they fought very bravely against the Israelis, very bravely.
The siege of Beirut had begun. The PLO was encircled. Some Palestinian leaders advised the PLO should surrender, but Arafat had other ideas.
في أحد الاجتماعات أحمد جبريل طرح الموافقة.
At one early meeting, the leader of the PFLP General Command, Ahmed Jibril, suggested accepting Israeli terms of withdrawal under the banner of the Red Cross, disarmed and in Red Cross provided overalls. Arafat said he would say a prayer to help him arrive at the decision. So he went away and returned and said, "I sense the winds of heaven blowing. God has ordered me to fight."
The winds of heaven, as Arafat described them, meant holding out for better conditions. In a bid to raise morale, Arafat and his officials toured the streets of the besieged Lebanese capital. Massive Israeli bombardment caused civilian casualties, but also strengthened the Palestinians' resolve. Finally, in August, after 2 months of siege and bombardment, US envoy Philip Habib announced that an agreement had been reached. The agreement gave safe passage for the PLO fighters to leave Lebanon on the understanding that Israeli forces would not enter West Beirut. The evacuation of the PLO marked the end of an era. After more than 10 years in Lebanon, the PLO was finally leaving. It was a dramatic moment for the fighters, for the Lebanese, and for the Palestinian refugees left behind. Most PLO leaders left to Damascus. But Arafat, signaling his displeasure with Syria, chose to go to Greece. Within days of the departure of the last Palestinian fighters, Lebanese President-elect Bashir Gemayel was assassinated. Breaking the American brokered agreement, Israeli forces moved into West Beirut under the pretext of keeping the peace. The Israelis accused the PLO of leaving 2,000 of its fighters in Beirut's refugee camps. the charge was a fabrication. The Israelis quickly encircled the refugee camps and brought in their allies from the Christian Lebanese Forces militia. On September 16, 1982, dozens of Lebanese Forces militiamen entered the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps.
We knew, of course, that the Israeli had surrounded the camp, and we also knew that in the night the flares was there, that the camp was lighted up. We saw it from far distance. And after I remembered, the night was very strange. It was so quiet. It was like a ghost town. And we didn't realize that inside this ghost town was the killing and the shooting.
Under the watchful eyes of their Israeli allies, the Lebanese militiamen embarked on one of the most horrific massacres of modern times. Skies were lit by Israeli flares as the militiamen continued their ugly work.
And then we came in the same way, and we saw the bodies. And I went around with my tape recorder. I had no crew, I had no television crew in the beginning, to count bodies, throwing up, counting bodies.
De har åpenbart blitt mishandlet. Et 20-talls menn fra 14.
And the more bodies we found out was there, in alleys, women killed, children killed, and we also saw they had used bulldozers to take the rubble over the dead bodies. We couldn't believe our eyes.
By the time it was finished, the Sabra and Shatila massacre had claimed the lives of some 800 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. The Israelis set up a tribunal to investigate the massacre. In its final report, the Kahan Commission found that Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon bore personal responsibility for the massacre. The PLO, in exile and no longer the force it once was, could only watch impotently. Stripped of his base in Lebanon, Arafat was in a political wilderness. Israel and its American benefactors had established a foothold in Lebanon, one that Syria, backed by the Soviet Union, sought to overthrow. In the eyes of Damascus, the much-weakened PLO was ripe for the taking, and the defeated Yasser Arafat was of no political consequence. But for the master of Palestinian politics, who had just emerged from doing battle with the Israelis, the fight for survival was about to enter a new and bloodier phase. In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. Expelled from Jordan and then Lebanon, the PLO seemed to be running out of options. Forced into a corner, its leader Yasser Arafat soon found himself engaged in a fratricidal fight for the control of the PLO and for his life. With the withdrawal of the bulk of its forces from Beirut, the PLO was in limbo once again. Few Arab countries wanted to welcome thousands of Palestinian fighters. For the first time, the PLO's existence in exile would be without the military force that had characterized its stays in Jordan and Lebanon. The price of defeat in Beirut soon appeared before Arafat. The weakened PLO leader found himself under attack from Palestinian leaders within the PLO and even from within his own Fatah faction. The critics said Arafat's style of leadership was too autocratic. and they accused him of abandoning the revolution by evacuating Beirut and seeking a negotiated settlement.
ياسر عرفات يريد أن يخرج من دائرة الصراع.
Yasser Arafat wants to abandon the struggle. We want to continue it. He came to Damascus and attempted a coup in Fatah to kill the revolution which we want to preserve. Arafat has sold out the cause. He is no longer interested in the revolution.
Syria, which had always wished to make the PLO subservient to its will, sought to exploit Arafat's vulnerability.
Every defeat has a price, and the part of the price was the split. At the time, Syria tried to settle the score with the PLO leadership. What transpired was a Syrian attempt to dominate Palestinian decision-making through direct Syrian intervention or through Syria's Palestinian tools. That was met with a resolute defense of independence of Palestinian decision-making. The Syrian intervention found a fertile breeding ground of differences and power struggles within Fatah.
أبو عمار يعني يتحمل مسؤولية أساسية في شق منظمة التحرير الفلسطيني في حين.
Arafat bears a direct responsibility for the split in the PLO. There were two choices then. Arafat made the choice that the resistance was futile.
Palestinian opponents to Arafat formed breakaway groups. Splitting from Arafat's main Fatah faction, one group called itself Fatah Intifada. Syria and Libya were only too willing to support the rebels. The tensions within the PLO were rising. The battle lines of a fratricidal struggle were beginning to appear.
للحقيقة أن مجمل المطالب التي تقدمت بها
Objectively speaking, in the beginning, the demands made to Arafat were just demands and possible to realize. I presented them to him. He said he could accept them, but he distrusted the intentions of his opponents. I conveyed his acceptance to Fatah Intifada. It was very obvious that they had no intention to arrive at an understanding. I was convinced that there was a conspiracy and that the split served the interest of certain Arab countries. It was a joint Syrian-Libyan decision.
هنا بدأنا بالدعوة إلى الحوار مع فتح.
We called for a dialogue to resolve the differences between both wings of Fatah. That was rejected by Arafat's opponents in Fatah Intifada. They thought they could take complete control of Fatah. On the other hand, Arafat's Fatah was initially receptive to our proposals.
Arafat's arch-rival Abu Nidal quickly allied himself with the anti-Arafat faction. In April of 1983, at a meeting in Portugal, the Abu Nidal organization assassinated Issam Sartawi, a leading PLO moderate and Arafat representative who had been negotiating with Israeli doves. Israeli leader Shimon Peres, also in attendance, was left alone.
أنا نفسي يوم من الأيام أكتب مقال.
We caught Sartawi's assassin later on. I saw him in Tunis and I asked him why he hadn't also shot Peres. He said his orders were to kill Sartawi, only Sartawi. One day I hope to write an article about Abu Nidal and Sartawi. I will call it, Who is a traitor, the murderer or the victim? The victim was innocent and honorable, a man who knew where his people's interests lay. But the murderer was a tool and a traitor.
Abu Nidal discredited the Palestinian cause in the eyes of the world when in 1985, two of his European cells attacked Rome and Vienna airports, killing 18 and wounding 140 people. A CIA document at the time claimed that Abu Nidal had not attacked a single Israeli target that year. In June 1983, Syria declared Arafat persona non grata and expelled him from Damascus. The break was cemented.
So what's going on now?
As you see, you have to go there on the field and to see by yourself what is going on.
What do you mean exactly?
No, I am leaving after I have a meeting here. After the meeting, I will leave.
You are meeting with whom?
With the Palestinians.
The Palestinians?
Yes.
You are leaving to where? To Saudi Arabia?
It's better for you to wait and see.
Okay. Anything to comment? What's going on now?
Everything is going in an excellent way.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
كان موقف القوات السورية خلالها في منطقة الاشتباك الفصل بين المتقاتلين. وفي اليوم التالي فوجئنا برسائل بعث بها عرفات إلى عدد من رؤساء الدول العربية بثتها وسائل الإعلام، تضمنت حملة من الافتراءات والأكاذيب والتجني ضد سوريا وضد قواتها المسلحة، متهمة القوات السورية بضرب مواقع الثورة الفلسطينية.
فيش واحد يقدر يمس فتح، فتح قوية جدا.
No one can harm Fatah. Fatah is very strong and no one can harm its leadership or unity. We cannot be dictated to. It would be very easy to get on a plane and go and surrender to Syrian President Hafez al-Assad. I assure you, if Fatah did that, both the problems and the factions would vanish. But we are against this for the sake of our people and the dignity of this movement and its martyrs.
كانت حساباته الكبرى استراتيجية.
Hafez al-Assad had grand strategic calculations. He viewed the Palestinian issue as his to guard and preserve. There is no such thing as the independence of Palestinian decision-making in the Syrian lexicon. Syria's foreign minister once told me so, and he added, Palestine is southern Syria.
In July 1983, fighting broke out in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon between pro- and anti-Arafat forces. Arafat now faced an armed revolt against his authority by pro-Syrian elements within the PLO. Arafat loyalists who had found their way back to Lebanon were besieged by the Syrian army and its Palestinian allies in the city of Tripoli in North Lebanon. In a daring air and sea journey from his new headquarters in Tunisia, Arafat managed to slip into Tripoli in disguise to join his fighters. Pro-Syrian Palestinians responded immediately.
فمن موقع المسؤولية التاريخية وباعتبار أن جيش التحرير الفلسطيني هو جيش منظمة التحرير الفلسطينية وذراعها القوية وأداتها الثورية، فإننا نعلن إسقاط شرعية ياسر عرفات كرئيس لمنظمة التحرير الفلسطينية، وأنه لا يمثل في أقواله وأفعاله سوى نفسه والشعب الفلسطيني منه براء.
The defense of Tripoli was led by Arafat's deputy Khalil al-Wazir, better known as Abu Jihad.
It's the matter of the Syrian decision.
He rejected the description of the ongoing battle as a purely Palestinian affair.
You see, those are, which tank is it? It's the tank from the Syrian army, you see. You can look, you can follow it. It's the T-54, you see. T-54 coming from the Syrian army, you see, brought to them. And they are led also by Syrian commanders, you see.
Arafat's opponents kept up the attacks, claiming they had the support among Palestinians in the occupied territories.
We can see that Yasser Arafat used to be a symbol for our people, but the people are beginning to gradually see the truth and realize what is happening. This person, who was entrusted as a fighter for the independence of Palestinian decision-making, is now abusing his position.
Such claims were not borne out by facts on the ground. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza rallied around Arafat, who expressed a philosophical view of the ongoing conflict.
You have to understand what the meaning of war. War is a loud voice for policy.
The loud voice of politics was taking a heavy toll on the residents of Tripoli. Faced with mounting pressure to end the conflict, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister traveled to Damascus and announced an agreement had been reached to end hostilities and evacuate Arafat's forces from Tripoli.
We have reached an agreement here based on the two principles that all parties have agreed to. These principles were to prevent any destruction of the city of Tripoli and stop the fighting between the factions around Tripoli and call for the withdrawal of armed forces, Palestinian armed forces out of Tripoli. All these principles have been enunciated in this document.
The United Nations made arrangements for Arafat and 4,000 of his fighters to depart the coastal Lebanese city on board 5 Greek ships. Following his second expulsion from Lebanon, Arafat once more defined the enforced exile as another step towards victory.
This is a part of this long march to our independent states, to our capital, Palestine, Jerusalem.
Beyond the rhetoric, Arafat seemed a spent force. But the elusive Palestinian leader had another card up his sleeve. Short of friends, Arafat traveled to Cairo to meet Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. It was a bold and dramatic act. Arafat became the first Arab leader to meet an Egyptian president since former President Anwar Sadat had signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1979. The Arab world was thunderstruck.
He thought long and hard. Do not imagine that it was an easy decision for him. He knew that he would antagonize the Fatah leadership because he didn't consult them. And he knew that Syria would brand him a traitor. In the end, as he always did, Arafat made the decision because he was convinced that it served the higher interests of the Palestinian people. But he was fully aware of the risks it entailed, and that the people who loved and supported him would find it incomprehensible.
Arafat's visit was a diplomatic coup for Mubarak, and in subsequent years, Egypt would increasingly become the PLO's main patron. Arafat's opponents within the PLO accused him of betraying the Palestinian cause. Syria castigated him as a traitor. Under attack, Arafat sought political refuge with his former adversary, King Hussein of Jordan. Since the PLO's expulsion from Jordan, relations between the two leaders had always been uneasy. But Arafat and King Hussein now came together in an uneasy alliance. The king allowed the Palestinian parliament in exile to convene in the Jordanian capital Amman in 1984. This proved a lifeline to Arafat. His ability to convene the Palestine National Council with the required quorum allowed him to maintain the legitimacy of his leadership of the PLO.
We looked for locations to hold the PNC meeting. There were suggestions of holding it on board a ship. If that session of the PNC hadn't taken place, the PLO wouldn't have finished and Palestinian legitimacy lost. So in spite of our reservations, it was convened in Amman.
The Jordanian PLO rapprochement led to the signing of the Amman Accord in February 1985. According to its terms, the PLO and Jordan would form a joint delegation to future negotiations for resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Syria opposed the accord and sought to exact retribution for Arafat's move. Once again, Lebanon was the battleground. The Syrian-backed Amal militia and anti-Arafat factions besieged the Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut and southern Lebanon. The camps were subjected to an on-and-off siege and onslaught for the next 3 years.
ما كان ممكن أمل أن تقدم على مثل هذا العمل.
Amal could not have become involved had the Syrians not asked them. The request was made to several Lebanese parties that all declined to have the responsibility of shedding Palestinian blood on their hands. Amal accepted the task.
The fighting and the harrowing experiences for the refugees would be termed the Camps War.
There were war criminals there too. Palestinian women were being shot in the head as they went for water, deliberately. And those criminals are walking around us, among us today. I can remember the savagery. I can remember one day, with so many Amal were firing so many machine guns, weapons into the camp, that there was a rustling sound, like they'd go, bop, 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 and then you'd hear. And it took me several minutes to realize what it was. They were firing so many bullets that the bullets were touching each other in the air as they were going into the camp. Walls of steel all touching each other, all the bullets, rustling like silk being torn up, you know.
One girl here was shot in the leg as she was trying to bring in food through the entrance that they now call the Death Passage. And another lady here who has a fractured hip, she was shot in the hip. They're forced to go out still to bring in food, and almost every day women are shot.
Comparisons were being drawn between the Sabra and Shatila massacres and the New Camps War.
الحرب طالت وأخذت طوابع دموية لن أنساها.
That war was very bloody and lasted a long time. The massacres perpetrated against the Palestinian people in that war were worse than Sabra and Shatila massacre. It was a wholesale destruction and indiscriminate killing. The Amal leadership should apologize to the Palestinian people if it genuinely wants closure. We have a record of everything, names and numbers.
They managed to crawl in from outside. They brought it from outside and they crawled in over the sandhills. And this is the second time that these girls have managed to come in this way.
We feel that nobody is feeling what we are suffering here. It's just a siege to continue killing the people. I can't see any political future or any victories for those who are sieging the camp, or even we can say that our people inside the camp is not looking for victories, just looking for peace and to live in a secure, honorable life only. And I hope that the world around us can hear these words and try his best to help our people to lift this siege.
Arafat suffered a further blow when Israeli warplanes raided his PLO headquarters in Tunisia, killing 160 people. Yet again, Arafat survived. The PLO leader continued to be elusive in political matters as well. Jordan's repeated attempts to induce him to honor the terms of the Amman Accords proved futile.
Chairman Arafat was a mercurial personality. He never kept any agreement he made with an Arab country if he found a more lucrative offer elsewhere. With the Amman Accords, he replaced the term confederation with the term twinning, as in twins. But this term has no basis in international law. It was the beginning of the end of the Amman Accords.
ما كانش عرفات عنده النية القوية في أن يأخذ ذلك الاتجاه.
Arafat had no real intention to commit to the agreement. It was more of a maneuver than a real attempt at finding a solution. I went to him to sign a document pertaining to the Amman Accords. He asked for some time to confer with the PLO leadership, left and didn't return. So we had a joke about him going missing.
توجه جاد للتعاون والمشاركة الأردنية الفلسطينية في الحل السياسي.
Having had enough, Jordan announced the abrogation of the Amman Accords almost 1 year after they had been signed. The Jordanians severely curtailed the activities of the PLO and expelled Abu Jihad.
I was satisfied to hear this evening a statement that was made public by one of the members of the cabinet in Jordan that they intend to close 25 out of the 32 PLO offices in Jordan, to put more restrictions on the activities of the PLO in Jordan.
we are not in one cage, as some are thinking. If we are in Lebanon or in Jordan having some problems, or in Syria, that will not put an end for the PLO or for our Palestinian struggle. We are still alive everywhere as Palestinian people. We are still alive in our occupied territories, facing the Israeli occupation.
Despite Jordanian frustration, many Palestinians believed Arafat had accomplished a masterly stroke.
اتفاق عمان ثبت إنه ياسر عرفات.
The Amman Accords was a brilliant tactical maneuver executed by Yasser Arafat. He used it to gain some breathing space. He established relations with Jordan, signed the agreement, and then abrogated it.
I was expecting this escalation from the Jordanian government.
As for Arafat himself, he feigned ignorance as to what had gone wrong.
But it seemed that in spite of all our efforts to cool down, they are insisting to make these troubles, which will affect indirectly or directly the Jordanian-Palestinian relation.
But Arafat paid the price of his political maneuvering. At an Arab summit in Amman in 1987, King Hussein refused to receive the Palestinian leader at the airport. As well as this diplomatic snub, the Palestinian issue was relegated to the periphery of the agenda. Arafat departed, claiming he was satisfied with the results of the summit, but he appeared to have reached the limits of his tactical capabilities. But, as before, the PLO leader found a lifeline. It was to come from an unexpected source. After decades of oppression, the Palestinians still living in the occupied territories were about to raise their voices. In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. After years of bloody infighting, the various Palestinian factions began to resolve their differences. Tumultuous events in the region were to prove both a solace and a setback for the Palestinian cause. By 1987, the various factions of the PLO had come closer together after the past 4 years of inter-Palestinian strife. The Palestinian Parliament in exile, the Palestine National Council, met in Algiers in April of that year. A common cause helped unify ranks. That cause was opposition to Jordan. The different factions all agreed to cancel the Amman Accords that had outlined a confederation between Jordan and the Palestinians.
بدأت محاولات جدية من قبل الأردن لاستعادة العلاقة الفلسطينية الأردنية على أساس
Jordan tried to restore Palestinian-Jordanian relations on a basis of political advantage to Jordan. We rejected the Amman Accords because we thought it impinged on our sovereignty. The agreement was abrogated at the Algiers PNC, which was called the National Unity Session.
وشاركت الجبهة في المجلس التوحيدي. السلطات السورية
The DFLP participated in the reunification of the PLO session, but the Syrian authorities punished the DFLP for participating in that PNC session and the Syrian intelligence prevented the DFLP members who attended from returning to Damascus.
National unity was the slogan of the time for the Palestinians, as they sought to put behind them the bitter squabbles and factional fighting of the past. That national unity was about to get a huge and popular boost from an unexpected place. In December 1987 in Gaza, an Israeli driver killed 4 Palestinian laborers and wounded 9 when his car ran off the road. The Israelis termed it an accident. The Palestinians said it was premeditated murder. Whatever the case, the incident sparked an outbreak of Palestinian protests that spread like wildfire throughout the occupied territories. The Intifada, or uprising, was born.
The Intifada was the first time since 1948 that Palestinians living under occupation were at the vanguard of resistance. From 1967 till 1987, the cause of Palestine was based on the premise that liberation would come from abroad.
We want exactly what the Israeli people enjoy: democracy, freedom, and independence. At the same time, the Intifada is a message of hope. It is a message of hope not only to the Palestinians, but also to their neighbors, the Israelis.
For the first time since 1967, the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories had become center stage in Palestinian affairs. The Fatah-dominated PLO were quick to see the potential of this popular uprising. Arafat and the men around him realized the importance of organizing cells within the Palestinian territories.
قال أبو جهاد لي بوضوح في وقتها ممدوح اتثق في أبو جهاد ولا لا؟ قلت له بثق فيه.
Arafat's deputy Abu Jihad told me very clearly then. He said, "We have neglected our people living under occupation and became embroiled in intrigue on the outside."
Palestinians in the homeland were now at the vanguard of the revolution. They became the symbol of resistance to occupation and an icon of the Palestinian struggle. Other important developments were also taking place. Amid the Intifada, the first signs of the emergence of a Palestinian Islamist movement began to appear.
Hamas was encouraged by Israel to form Islamic societies, specifically in Gaza, before Oslo. Because when Arafat was still a super terrorist, unquote, before he became a super statesman, and then of course later was made a super terrorist again, Hamas was seen as a logical balancing act for the Israelis to play against the PLO. Increase the religiosity, increase the Islamic element of Palestinian society, and the nationalist, quote, terrorist, unquote, element goes down.
However, the Israelis did not seem to realize that these new Islamist groups would also be intent on liberating Palestine. The seeds of a new force in Palestinian politics were planted, a force which began to compete with the PLO factions in the showdown with the Israeli occupation. This new and growing Islamist trend, which heralded the formation of such groups as Islamic Jihad and Hamas, found natural allies in several wealthy Arab states.
We attended a meeting and more than half of those in attendance were Kuwaitis and not Palestinians. I found that surprising. Chairman Arafat knew that Hamas received support from the popular level in the Arab Gulf states. The PLO, on the other hand, wasn't allowed to solicit donations because it was bound by agreements with the host governments to receive support only from them.
However, support for the Islamist groups among the Palestinians was still in its infancy. Wary of the new challenge, Arafat and Abu Jihad soon stamped their authority on the Intifada. Arafat knew the Palestinian uprising had thrown the Palestinians a lifeline that could help them realize their aspirations for a homeland.
بالنسبة إلى ياسر عرفات لا وجود لشيء اسمه انتفاضة من أجل انتفاضة.
For Yasser Arafat, there is no such thing as an intifada for the sake of an intifada. It's an intifada or an uprising to achieve a certain political goal. Hence, he was always in a state of uprising.
نحن لا نقاتل من أجل القتال ولكن نقاتل من أجل سلام عادل.
In March of 1988, Abu Jihad sent a group of Palestinian commandos into Israel. The gunmen hijacked a passenger bus in the Negev desert, transporting employees to Israel's top-secret nuclear complex at Dimona. In the ensuing firefight, the 3 hijackers and 3 Israeli employees were killed. The Israelis were exasperated with the Intifada and with the cells Abu Jihad was organizing. A month after the bus attack on April 16, 1988, an Israeli commando force assassinated Abu Jihad at his home in the Tunisian coastal town of Sidi Bou Said. Far from stifling the Intifada, Abu Jihad's assassination had the opposite effect. The occupied territories erupted in angry demonstrations. Abu Jihad's funeral was held at the Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp in Damascus. Hundreds of thousands of mourners attended to pay their respects. 5 years after his expulsion from Syria, and after years of a bitter feud, Arafat returned to Damascus for the funeral. He was given a hero's welcome. It turned out to be a vote of confidence for the Arafat-led PLO in the heartland of his rivals.
في حينها استقبل أبو عمار في المخيم واستقبلت الجنازة في المخيم استقبال شعبي رهيب.
There was a tremendous turnout at the funeral. The coffin was carried for hours throughout the camp. People tried to lift the car carrying Arafat off the ground as a token of their support. He was carried on people's shoulders. It shook the splinter groups opposed to him because it restored the stature of Arafat and Fatah's leadership.
The Intifada propelled the Palestinian issue onto the world headlines and back to the top of the agenda for the Arab world. It was an extraordinary turnaround. Just a year earlier, at an Arab summit in Amman, the Palestinian issue had been relegated to the bottom of the agenda. Now, in June 1988, at an extraordinary meeting in Algiers, Arab heads of state pledged strong support for the Intifada and the Palestinian people.
وستصبح فلسطين عربية ليس بالكلام ولكن بجيل الغرب الذي يقود الثورة الآن والذي هو اللي دفعنا إلى الاجتماع الذي ما كنا نفكر فيه في هذا المستقبل المنظور.
At the end of July, Jordan formally broke off all political and administrative ties with the West Bank. King Hussein effectively renounced his kingdom's historic claim to the West Bank, paving the way for the area to be part of a Palestinian state if ever Israeli occupation were to end there.
أننا أعلنا موقفنا الواضح حول تمسكنا بحق الشعب الفلسطيني في تقرير مصيره على ترابه الوطني بما في ذلك حقه في إقامة دولته الفلسطينية المستقلة قبل قرار قمة الرباط بأكثر من عامين. وهذا هو الموقف الذي سنظل متمسكين به إلى أن يحقق الشعب الفلسطيني أهدافه الوطنية كاملة غير منقوصة بمشيئة الله.
كما تفضلت طفح الكيل وتجاوزنا الخط الأحمر، حاولنا المستحيل، دعمنا المنظمة بكافة القرارات التي.
We had had enough and done everything possible. We supported the PLO, but in the end we concluded that the PLO had to be independent of us.
The Palestinians were jubilant, but King Hussein's decision was opposed by some senior Jordanian officials.
وصل جلالة الملك مرحلة لا يعتقد.
King Hussein had concluded that he could no longer hope to regain the whole of the West Bank, and that therefore he had to put an end to any misunderstandings. If concessions were required, let the Palestinians make them, not Jordan.
المسألة كانت محاولة.
It was an attempt to give priority to Jordanian matters and step away from the historic burden of responsibility for the West Bank. I disagree with the decision, which wasn't an easy one for His Majesty to make.
In November, the Palestine National Council met in Algiers, where Arafat made a historic announcement.
وباسم الشعب العربي الفلسطيني قيام دولة فلسطين فوق أرضنا الفلسطينية وعاصمتها القدس الشريف.
The formal declaration of a Palestinian state was a defining moment. But the Palestinians understood that establishing a state would require more than rhetoric. The PLO had no control of any territory.
I hope that the Israelis will understand this. I will try to be positive in their response. The same thing also at the US. I'm an American.
Well, I'm rather disappointed because instead of facing reality and drawing the necessary conclusion, they have engaged in an evasive sort of resolutions, which in real terms are meaningless.
Palestinians also understood that America's backing was imperative if the dream of Palestinian statehood was to be fulfilled. And they began to realize that their longtime ally, the Soviet Union, was no longer the dependable friend of old.
فكنت أنا والأخ أبو عمار واجتمعنا مع غورباتشيف.
Arafat and I met with Gorbachev. I felt we had no common ground with him, that he didn't see our viewpoint. We told him the Palestinian people had a very high literacy rate, and he said, "Sure, the Israelis fear you." I realized then that he was no friend of ours, and I did not set foot in the Soviet Union afterwards.
Arafat's declaration implicitly recognized the State of Israel, though this was never explicitly stated. It was enough for U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz to ask his Swedish counterpart Sten Andersson to convey a letter to the PLO.
جاء رئيس الوزراء ليقول للرئيس أبو عمار.
The message was that if you, Yasser Arafat, declared the following points in public, chief amongst which was the renunciation of terrorism, then the United States would be prepared to recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization and establish a dialogue with it.
The General Assembly of the United Nations was preparing to convene in New York. Yasser Arafat was scheduled to give a speech. What he did not count on was America's refusal to grant him an entry visa. In an unprecedented move, the General Assembly moved its meeting to its headquarters in Switzerland. Arafat delivered his speech and waited to reap the diplomatic rewards. He believed that by implicitly recognizing Israel and renouncing armed struggle, he had met America's conditions to open a dialogue with the PLO.
Hereby once more declare that I condemn terrorism in all its forms.
But the Americans did not hear the terminology they required about the renunciation of terrorism, and not all Palestinians believed the price was worth paying.
I said, what do we get for renouncing terrorism, meaning the right to launch military operations? I was against making this concession. I said, let's await the reaction to your speech and then we'll see. But I was overruled.
But Arafat's mind was made up. Desperate for American recognition, the next day he held a press conference and uttered the magic words.
Totally and absolutely renounce all forms of terrorism.
The US announced that it was now ready to begin a dialogue with the PLO. Several sessions of talks were held between PLO officials and Washington's ambassador to Tunisia, Robert Pelletro. The talks failed to satisfy Arafat's aspirations. As it was, the dialogue did not last long. Yet another Palestinian faction was about to make world headlines through violence. The Palestine Liberation Front, headed by Abu al-Abbas, had first come to prominence back in 1985 with the hijacking of the Italian cruise liner, the Achille Lauro. The operation quickly fell apart and the Palestinian gunmen gained infamy when they killed and threw overboard a wheelchair-bound American. Now, in June 1990, the Palestine Liberation Front struck again. a unit of its commandos landed on a Tel Aviv beach intending to kill Israelis. The attack was quickly thwarted. Years later, the group's leader admitted the operation was aimed at derailing the negotiations.
One of the political goals of the operation was to stop the Palestinian-American dialogue, which we felt was an insult to the Palestinian revolution and Palestinians in general.
The Americans wanted the PLF punished. Arafat refused.
شكل أبو عمار لجنة تحقيق.
Arafat refused the American requests because he felt the Palestinians had gained nothing from the dialogue with America, which wasn't supposed to be about the ABCs of the Palestinian issue, but about something more substantial. His message to the Americans was, if you want me to halt military operations, then you have to move on the political level.
I told Arafat that if punishing us would help restore the national rights of the Palestinian people, then he should go ahead and do it. He refused and said he wasn't going to be blackmailed, and the dialogue was severed.
Any hope of a resumption of dialogue was soon overshadowed by another tumultuous event in the Middle East. In August 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, changing the political face of the region. Arafat failed to unequivocally condemn the Iraqi occupation and announced he was seeking an Arab solution to the issue, a position supported by the Palestinians of the occupied territories.
We were seeking an Arab resolution to the crisis and tried to preclude any outside involvement to solve it among Arabs. We had an official initiative to get Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait.
Abu Iyad told me, I don't want to talk to the Iraqis, it's hopeless. I interviewed Arafat at the time and begged him. I told him Saddam was going to lose and advised Arafat not to support him. He was hesitant, especially towards the end, but he couldn't break away from Saddam Hussein.
Arafat's position was criticized within the PLO. Salah Khalaf, also known as Abu Iyad, who was now recognized as Arafat's second-in-command, distrusted Saddam Hussein from the outset.
The last time I saw him was just before Saddam Hussein started making his move on Kuwait. It was just after the Abu Abbas affair, and I was in Tunis and met Abu Iyad, and he said, you know, this is Saddam's doing, this Abu Abbas affair, and he's courting Arafat, he's trying to get Arafat to move the headquarters to Baghdad, and he said he has something in mind. I don't know what it is, but I'm trying to figure it out, because he wants the Palestinians Saddam wants the Palestinians in his corner when it happens. And we have to figure out what he's up to, because it's going to be bad news for us. You know, whenever an Arab regime tries to get its hands on us, we know there's trouble. And so he said, it's very important for us that the US PLO dialogue not be ended, because that's why Saddam did this. He wants to force an end to it, because he doesn't want us to be dealing with you.
Abu Iyad's opposition to Arafat's alliance with Saddam proved his death sentence. In 1991, a few days before the air campaign to liberate Kuwait was launched, Abu Iyad was gunned down in Tunis. The perpetrator was Arafat's old nemesis, Abu Nidal, who was once again Iraq's gun for hire. Ironically, Abu Iyad had, in the past, turned down the opportunity to have Abu Nidal killed.
كان يقول لي لا يمكن أنا ماكل ببيته هذا خبز وملح مع أولاده.
Abu Iyad used to tell me that he couldn't order a hit on Abu Nidal because he had broken bread with him at his home. He said he couldn't kill him for the sake of his children. So what happened? Abu Nidal assassinated him. I swear more than once I told Arafat and Abu Iyad that I'd have Abu Nidal killed in Baghdad. If his Iraqi friends got upset, then I'd fix things with them. But Arafat and Abu Iyad turned down my offer.
ناس مثل أبو إياد وناس مثل أبو جهاد كاثنين كانوا مؤثرين.
People like Abu Iyad and Abu Jihad had an influence on Arafat's decisions and the policies he adopted. By taking them out, Arafat was left with no effective people around him. Ultimately, this had a negative effect in the years to come.
By the end of February, Saddam Hussein's army had been ejected from Kuwait. His regime almost shattered.
بعد حرب الخليج الثانية كل الدول العربية خسرت حرب.
After the Gulf War, all Arabs lost so much. They lost everything. The occupation of Kuwait by the Iraqis was a stain on our honor. There is absolutely no excuse for it.
لكنه لم يتخذ موقفا أن يؤيد الاحتلال بشكل واضح وصريح.
Arafat did not openly and clearly condemn the occupation of Kuwait. At the same time, he didn't openly and clearly support it. He tried in his own way to simultaneously play both sides, and his position was interpreted as supporting the Iraqis. His calculations were wrong, and we paid a tremendous price for them.
Arafat had hoped the international community would link an Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait to Israeli concessions in the occupied territories. But the Palestinian leader miscalculated badly. The dreams of statehood and recognition he had harbored not too long ago now lay in ruins. In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. With the prospect of a new order in the region, the PLO needed to shift emphasis from revolution to negotiation. But new political forces were making their presence felt within Palestinian society, threatening the role and relevancy of the PLO. Following the 1991 Gulf War, US President George Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker decided it was high time to resolve the problems in the Middle East. They devised a formula to bring a reluctant Israel to the negotiating table.
I think Bush was really annoyed, and he and Baker came up with this idea, which I thought was actually quite smart, and said, you can have the loans, but only if you agree to a complete freeze on settlements, because we are not going to subsidize policies in the West Bank that we oppose.
In the US Congress, Baker increased the pressure on the Israelis, goading them to call.
It's going to take some really good faith, affirmative effort on the part of our good friends in Israel. And if we don't get it, and if we can't get it quickly, I have to tell you, Mr. Levine, that everybody over there should know that the telephone number is 1-202-456-1414. When you're serious about peace, call us.
The American strategy worked, and Israeli and Arab delegations attended a peace conference in the Spanish capital Madrid in October 1991. Although PLO leader Yasser Arafat was not invited, he was well represented by Palestinian negotiators from Gaza and the West Bank. Arafat kept a tight rein on the Palestinian negotiators, and they made sure they towed the party line.
نحن شاركنا في افتتاح المؤتمر، ولكن شاركنا بالمشاهدة على التلفزيون ولكن من أرض مدريد.
The speech delivered by Haider Abdel Shafi in Madrid was written by Hanan Ashrawi and Nabil Chaath. Mamdouh Naufal and Akram Haniyeh contributed to it. But in the end, it was faxed to Tunis, and we waited till morning until by return fax we got Arafat's blessing with notes and amendments in his handwriting. The Americans and the Spanish knew this.
After the Madrid conference, further negotiations continued in Washington. Away from the media spotlight, secret talks were also held between Israeli and Palestinian officials. In April 1992, a plane carrying Yasser Arafat crashed in the Libyan desert. Arafat survived, but the crash highlighted the lack of any clear successor to the Palestinian leader. The transition of power was becoming an increasingly important matter. In the Palestinian territories, Islamist factions, which were not members of the PLO, were steadily building a solid base of support. They were vocally opposed to the negotiations Arafat was conducting with Israel.
After failure of the secular system practice their ideas in Madrid, the people will shift voluntarily, without any force or violence, towards the Islamic movement.
Many Palestinians shared such views, unconvinced that negotiations with Israel would lead to a breakthrough. Aware of this skepticism, Arafat gave the go-ahead to a secret channel of talks in the Norwegian capital, Oslo.
Arafat's strategy was to open many channels and let many people try to achieve something. He keeps his windows open and awaits the incoming winds. The end result is what's important, not the person or persons delivering the goods.
On August 20th, 1993, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators reached accord in Oslo, agreeing to a framework for resolving their decades-long conflict. The Oslo Accords were announced to the world. Hamas was quick to condemn the accords. It was a first sign of a growing divide between Hamas and the PLO. On September 13, 1993, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO leader Yasser Arafat shook hands and sealed the deal at the White House.
The children of Abraham, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, have embarked together on a bold journey. Together, today, with all our hearts and all our souls, we bid them shalom, salam, peace.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
إن معركة السلام أيتها السيدات والسادة هي أصعب معارك حياتنا، وهي تستحق منا كل الجهود، لأن أرض السلام تتوق للسلام العادل والشامل.
It was the first time the Israeli and Palestinian leaders had come face to face. Condemnation of the Oslo Accords spread like wildfire throughout the Arab world.
On this black day, the PLO betrays the blood of the martyrs who fell for their homeland. Today, the PLO has harmed beyond belief its own people and sold out their right in their homeland, Palestine. Today, the PLO recognizes Israel and acknowledges Israeli sovereignty over the whole of historical Palestine.
Notwithstanding these criticisms, the Oslo Accords found supporters in the Palestinians.
فيصل بعرفها منه شخصيا، قال لي إنه هو بادر إلى اقتراح.
Faisal Husseini, God rest his soul, used to say that he had reservations about the Oslo Accords.
but he called it our child, and that it was better for us to defend Jerusalem from Ramallah next door than defend it from faraway Tunis.
But the peace process initiated by the Oslo Accords soon began to founder. On February 25, 1994, Baruch Goldstein, a Jewish extremist, opened fire on Palestinian worshippers in the main mosque of Hebron, killing 29 and wounding 150. Just weeks later, Hamas responded with 2 suicide bombings inside Israel, killing 15 civilians. Suicide attacks were to become a trademark tactic of Hamas. The mosque massacre and the suicide attacks did not preclude the signing of the Gaza-Jericho Agreement in May 1994, in which Israel agreed to undertake troop withdrawals from those areas. In July 1994, Arafat returned to Gaza. He received a hero's welcome. It was the first time in 27 years that the PLO leader returned to the homeland he had devoted his life to regaining. The return heralded the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority, or PNA, set up to fulfill the terms of the Oslo Accords and administer the Palestinian territories. But Arafat found it difficult to make the transition from the leader of a liberation movement to the builder of a nation.
الأخ أبو عمار بنى سلطة تقوم على قاعدة شمولية توتاليتارية.
Chairman Arafat built his authority on a totalitarian basis. The criteria for admission to the instruments of state was contingent upon being a member of his Fatah movement and recommendation of one of his security apparatus. It was single-party rule with no accountability.
As Arafat tried to build the foundations of state, he also needed to continue negotiations. Final status issues such as the status of Jerusalem, security, borders, and refugees remained unresolved. But the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, maintained a hardline negotiating stance. It did not endear him to US President Bill Clinton.
Well, initially, I mean, he actually said after this first set of meetings when Netanyahu came, he left the room and he said, who does he think the superpower is? He is and we're not.
Final status issues came back on the negotiating table following the election of Ehud Barak as Israeli Prime Minister in 1999. Barak quickly gained the ear of the US president.
And Barak's logic is, what do I need and what do I want? I want to get to a final status agreement with the Palestinians by the time you, President Clinton, leave office. That's what he tells him in August '99 when he visits him.
Barak's offer was for Israel to withdraw from much of the West Bank while keeping sovereignty over key parts of Jerusalem. In 2000, he convinced Clinton of the need to convene a meeting with Arafat in the United States to resolve the final issues.
When he couldn't say no to the president, he came with a profound suspicion and resentment. Suspicion that the Americans and the Israelis were going to present him with a fait accompli that he couldn't accept, and resentment at Ehud Barak, who he believed had chased the Israeli-Syrian negotiation for the preceding 7 months, ignoring him and Israel's commitments, and who was prepared to give to Assad 99.9% of the Golan Heights, minus 400 yards off the northeastern portion of the lake. And yet, Mr. Barak's offer to Arafat at Camp David was 90%.
Barak refused to meet alone with Arafat at Camp David.
Now at Camp David, Barak took this position, I don't want to meet alone with Arafat. I don't want to build that kind of personal connection because, again, once I'm with Arafat alone, he will write down everything, and Barak would say, he always has this note, Arafat always has this notepad, and he writes down everything that people say. He'll keep it in his pocket, and one day he'll come out and say, Barak has agreed to divide Jerusalem, and so I can't accept that.
كيف تريد من عرفات أن يذهب إلى كامب ديفيد
وأن ينهي النزاع هناك.
How do you want Arafat to go to Camp David and end the conflict without getting a written offer from Barak? I'm certain that if he had been presented with a written offer, he would have asked to have had it initialed and put it in his pocket. I'm certain of that.
Before agreeing to attend the Camp David summit, Arafat sought assurances that he would not be made a scapegoat if the talks failed. Arafat rejected Barak's proposals at Camp David. He concluded the Palestinian state envisaged would not be viable, made up of cantons and completely surrounded by territory to be annexed to Israel.
And then what does Clinton do? He breaks his promise and blames Arafat for the failure of Camp David. So Arafat is made out to be a liar. That's plain shameful.
Much of the Western media criticized Arafat at the time for rejecting the proposals. But today, former US administration officials acknowledge that Arafat had little choice.
What was presented at Camp David, I think, if you ask any American negotiator today, any of us, do we think the Palestinians could have accepted the ideas that could have accepted the ideas that President Clinton put on the table or already briefed Arafat on in July 2000? I think they would all say, they would have to say in hindsight, no. We couldn't accept them. Couldn't accept them because there was no way he could defend a 9-to-1 swap. There's no way he could accept Israeli sovereignty over the Haram. There's no way he could accept this patchwork of sovereignty over Jerusalem, etc., etc. In fact, the proof of the matter is the Palestinian leaders who today are lauded as the most moderate, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, etc., Yasser Abed Rabo, they all rejected what was on the table or not on the table at Camp David in terms that were even more harsh than Arafat himself. They were adamantly against them. So that tells you something about whether these were the kind of proposals that, that a Palestinian could accept.
Should he have taken the deal at Camp David? Probably not.
A last-ditch attempt by Clinton at the end of his presidency failed to produce an agreement, and Arafat was blamed.
I blame it partly on Clinton and Dennis. They told the incoming administration, Bush and Cheney, literally on Inauguration Day, that Arafat was totally responsible for the failure of the peace process, and that he was a liar and you couldn't count on him, you shouldn't deal with him.
After the meeting at Camp David, Arafat returned to Gaza and received a hero's welcome for refusing to accept what the Palestinians viewed as unacceptable. He was, by now, however, a pariah in Washington, unwelcome and untrusted. Just weeks later, the Second Intifada erupted, triggered by Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, or Noble Sanctuary, in Jerusalem. The Palestinians had lost hope with the diplomatic approach. Amid the death and violence of the new Intifada, Hamas increased its role and its power base in the occupied territories. In Israel, Barak lost the elections to the leader of the Israeli opposition, Arafat's old arch-rival, Ariel Sharon. Sharon was in no mood for concession, and following the September 11th attacks on the United States, he was quick to spot an opportunity to get the Americans more on his side.
September 11 allowed Sharon to gain sympathy for Israel's internal security situation. In effect, what he was saying was that what you in America faced on September 11, I face on a daily basis. And Sharon was able to convince the world that Yasser Arafat was the source of terrorism.
Israeli military actions that killed children, women, and the elderly caused Palestinian reactions to be emotional instead of political, and therefore revenge became the source of justice for the weak. The Israelis knew this, I believe. The crushing of the Palestinians' political backbone is one of the great achievements of the Israeli army during the Intifada. So in other words, there was chaos.
In the spring of 2002, Ariel Sharon decided to hold Yasser Arafat personally responsible for every act of violence perpetrated against Israel. Israeli forces quickly surrounded Arafat's headquarters in Ramallah and set out to systematically destroy all the instruments of Palestinian state infrastructure. Besieged and with few remaining allies, Arafat turned down an offer from Sharon to depart. He feared he would not be allowed to return. Instead, Arafat announced that he would fight to the very end. Under pressure, Arafat devolved some of his powers to the newly appointed Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen. But in Arafat's eyes, Abbas proved ineffective.
I was with Arafat when Prime Minister Abbas was in Washington, and Arafat received a phone call telling him it was no good. The White House had not agreed to him regaining his freedom. At that point, Arafat said, if the Americans refuse to grant Abbas the freedom of Yasser Arafat, the democratically elected president of the Palestinian people, does he think they will give him the rights of the Palestinian people in Jerusalem and borders and the issue of refugees? They will not. Arafat subsequently quickly moved to engineer the fall of Abu Mazen's cabinet, and he did.
Surrounded in his Ramallah headquarters, Arafat held out until October of 2004, when he was struck down by a mysterious illness. Israel said it would allow him to seek treatment abroad and return. Arafat died in a Paris hospital, cause unknown. The Palestinians claimed he was poisoned. The Israelis protested their innocence.
Interested in what we are going to say about former President Arafat. He was an icon in the proper sense of the word. He was not only concerned with the liberation of the Arab people, but of all the oppressed people throughout the world, Arabs and non-Arabs. And to lose a man of that stature and thinking is a great blow to all those who are fighting against oppression. We regret that, and we give our condolences to his family and to the Arab people to which he belonged.
What a shameful thing, the way the world stood by and watched while Arafat was treated that way in the last years of his life. It's absolutely shameful.
Following Arafat's death, Mahmoud Abbas was elected president of the Palestinian Authority. But he lacked the power base and hold over Palestinian politics that Arafat had established. Abbas soon faced a challenge to his authority from Hamas, the Islamic movement, which now commanded the loyalty of a large proportion of Palestinians. In January 2006, Hamas defeated the Fatah movement of Abbas in parliamentary elections. A power struggle ensued between the Palestinian Authority led by Abbas and Hamas. Gun battles broke out between Fatah and Hamas gunmen. In the summer of 2007, Hamas fighters captured the Fatah headquarters in Gaza, securing control of the area. Gaza became the confirmed stronghold of Hamas. Fatah had been supplanted.
Would Arafat have lost control of Gaza the way Abu Mazen did?
It's hard to believe that he would have, for one simple reason. Arafat was an icon. He lost a lot of support among Palestinians. I felt it, even as time went by. But he was an icon because he put the Palestinian issue on the international map. He established for the international community a sense that somehow what he identified as Palestinian national aspirations had to be achieved. So he put the Palestinian movement on the world stage, and he also unified the Palestinians in a way that no other leader had.
I think what's happened since he has died should tell us something about how central he was to the Palestinian map. And it is ironic that even some of those who were most critical of Arafat among Palestinians during his final days are the most eager to rally behind his name and his picture and his flag today.
Today, the Palestine Liberation Organization is no longer the force it once was. The emergence of new groups such as Hamas has eroded support for the traditional PLO. Rather than being a unifying force, the PLO is now a protagonist in inter-Palestinian discord. The revolution, started over 40 years ago, may have faded, but the dreams of the Palestinians for statehood live on, as strong as ever.